Good morning. Advanced English conversation again. And we've been talking about pop psychology. Talked about it a bit last week. And now let's kind of wrap up the discussion of pop psychology by explaining what the term actually means. I made you guess and talk about it. Let me give you now maybe a definitive answer. Pop psychology refers to maybe several different things, several different ways in which kind of psychology terms or knowledge or ideas come into the popular culture or the pop culture or the general culture or kind of public discourse, that is public conversation, discussion, daily conversation, news media, the internet, SNS, things like that. And this comes in several different forms. Many of them are often a distortion or misunderstandings of psychology. And a few of them are maybe less harmless, sometimes helpful, but a lot of them are not so accurate. So the first category would be things like advice and self-help books and materials. So there are a lot of self-help books in bookstores or online bookstores, as well as TV shows and radio shows where people kind of give advice, psychological advice or counseling kinds of advice. And there are some popular TV shows, for example, in the States, in the US, like Dr. Phil, for example, where people give psychological advice in a way that seems kind of encouraging and also kind of entertaining. One problem is with, say, a TV show, I don't know exactly about Dr. Phil's qualifications. He's a very popular pop psychology TV star in the US. But if he just is meeting some couple on stage and he doesn't really have time to do careful interviewing over weeks and weeks to really understand the people, he's just giving kind of advice on stage right there. That kind of cheapens the whole counseling and therapy process. You can't really give good advice to somebody. And psychological therapy is not just about getting advice. It's about talking through your problems and understanding your problems with a qualified professional. And it's not just the advice. It's the self-understanding that you get from it and explaining your problems. So that's a misuse of psychology. Another big problem with these kinds of things, self-help books and advice, based media, shows, magazine articles, etc. Many times the people giving the advice are not properly trained psychologists. They maybe have a college degree in psychology, but that's not enough. To really give good advice, you need to have at least a master's degree or a PhD, and on top of that, proper training and certification. You do some stuff to get properly certified, recognized as a professional therapist. Many people writing these books, they are not qualified psychology therapists or counselors, and they don't know the psychology research very well, or they don't understand it. For example, if a book comes out saying about left brain, right brain stuff, and popularizing some of the myths, the false ideas that we talked about left and right brains, hemisphere stuff, the person clearly does not understand psychology research or neuroscience, because the differences between left and right brain, they're there, but they're kind of really minor differences, as I explained last week. And that's no secret. That's been the fact that different aspects of language are done in different parts of the brain, and different aspects of music or math are done in different parts of the brain. That's been known for decades in psychology. It's no secret. So these are people who maybe want to be famous or they want to make money. Maybe they want to help, but they're not qualified properly to help. Now, there may be a few writers who are qualified. You might occasionally find qualified writers doing this. one example, when I was doing my PhD and I was dealing with my perfectionism as a PhD student, I read a really good book on perfectionism. Is by a professional psychological therapist, and he talked about the psychology of perfectionism and some patients he treated. He treated some really bad cases, and it was really good because he understood the research and the counseling. And he was a proper psychologist, and it was a helpful book. Another book that I read, I have it somewhere. I'm still unpacking my books here. Is a book that I have is about the psychology of regret, and it's by a psychology professor at the University of Illinois. I took his class one time, Neil Rose, and it's a helpful psychological explanation about the psychology of regret. It's written for a more general educated audience. It didn't sell very well, but it's a good book. I think it didn't sell because I think he needed maybe some more real life examples and maybe more about application. But it was a really good book for understanding the psychology of regret. Quite interesting. Another kind of self-help subgenre is maybe motivational books and motivational speeches. Motivational speeches are kind of popular sometimes on the internet, and also business conferences, at least in North America. Business conferences, business people go and attend a big business conference, and often a highlight of these business conferences is an invited motivational speaker. And the speaker gives some great motivational speech that's designed to encourage the people in the audience. But the person is maybe not really qualified. They don't really know anything about the psychology of motivation or the psychology of whatever people really need to overcome their difficulties. Maybe people want to overcome problems in the company or their company success, or in their personal relationships in the company, or in their personal lives. But the person speaking is not really qualified. They have some great interesting story. It's often something like, oh, I overcame cancer, so if I overcame cancer, you could overcome your problems. Well, or I climbed Mount Everest by myself. I overcame this great challenge in life, so if I can do it, you can do it too. But the principles that they talk about, that they learn from their own life experience, it's not relevant to other people. Okay, if you overcame cancer, that's cool, that's great, but that's not going to help people in the audience come up with a better business strategy or solve their company's problems or their workplace problems. It's not relevant. And here's a cool book. It's by a journalist. This kind of book is what we call an expose. It exposes a problem. This book, Yes You Can, is by a journalist who exposes this whole kind of industry of motivational speakers who give talks to business people, and how these people are really unqualified in their advice. Makes for a great speech, but it's advice that's not relevant to the typical person in the audience. Other kinds of pop psychology include, myths, total false ideas, and urban legends, that is, false stories that have become popular. So one common myth we talked about, the idea that people use only 10% of their brain. Complete nonsense. Or kind of false stories about, for example, the great psychologist B.F. Skinner supposedly was a very cruel father and raised his daughter in a Skinner box. And that's not true. It's a myth. He did not mistreat his daughter. Many of his ideas were kind of not helpful in psychology, but his daughter says he was a good father. Okay, I think not a great psychologist, not so great a psychologist, but okay, not bad as a father. Other things are might be public perceptions about psychological ideas, that may be kind of popular ideas about things in psychology that are controversial they may not be valid at all, or they may be questionable, or they may be controversial. We talked about intelligence, and that's whole big controversy and debate in psychology where nobody really has clear answers about some of the big questions. We have these IQ tests, and some people think, oh, it's valid, and there's this multiple intelligence stuff, and some people think that's good. And some of the stuff, it's either controversial or it doesn't have a real scientific basis for it. And then there are just various concepts that have become popular, concepts and ideas and things like personality tests, and those may be somewhat helpful, but they're not scientific or reliable. Emotional intelligence, that in itself is valid, as long as it's materials or talks or advice from somebody who's properly trained in psychology. Yes, that can be helpful. Sometimes it's not, because the people talking about it don't really understand the psychology. They don't have proper training in psychology. So while some things in what we call pop psychology might be valid, emotional intelligence, for example, if it's done right, a lot of these are misunderstandings of psychology. Things like the self-help industry, self-help books, TV advice shows, left brain, right brain stuff, brain myths, wrong ideas about learning preferences or learning styles, things that we talked about last week. So basically, pop psychology is often popular misunderstandings or misinterpretation of psychology. Sometimes misrepresentation of psychology. People misrepresenting psychology, for example, in order to promote a website. Here, go to this website, take this left brain, right brain test. They do it to make money or to become famous or to, get a popular website going or something like that. So those are even outright misrepresentations. They're falsely presenting psychological information, or pretending that they know what they're talking about when they don't. So pop psychology, in short, not always, but much of the time, are misunderstandings or misrepresentations or false conceptions, false beliefs about psychology, psychological ideas and concepts. So we've talked about psychology. In this class, we'll come back a little bit more to psychology, because it will help us to understand some other popular ideas that are really, becoming kind of a social problem. Later in this semester, we're going to talk about things like conspiracy theories, why people believe in that, and psychology is going to help us again to understand some of that. So, in the rest of the course, we're going to move on to myths about language and education, and about academia, the academic world, and science. Myths, false understandings, misunderstandings about science and health news and things like that. So that's it for now, and depending on the class, you're going to move on to another segment today or the next day. All right, take care. See you later.